Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the fork fluid and your fork seals on your Showa SFF triple air chamber forks. The Showa SFF TAC forks are just one of many air forks that are out there, and replacing the oil and fork seals on these can be intimidating, but we're going to help you get through that process and simplify it as best as we can. Now, SFF, that stands for separate function fork. So the left fork, that's going to control all of your dampening. So rebound and compression is on this side. There's no spring in here. The right side is your air spring. This is the TAC or triple air chamber. So you have an inner chamber, outer chamber, and your balance chamber. Now you're going to find these forks on the 15 through 18 KX450Fs, your 15 through 17 RMZ450s, and your 15 through 17 CRF250Rs, but there are some differences. So the Kawasaki's and Suzuki's will have this piggyback reservoir on the outside. The Hondas actually have this built inside, but the rebuild process will be similar. But for those reasons and clickers, any fluid specs, you want to refer to your model specific service manual. Now these forks, they came off a 2015 KX450F. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into this. To do this job, we need some common hand tools and some special tools. We're going to use the TAC fork cap tool. We also have a 50mm fork cap wrench, the Tusk digital suspension pump, 49mm seal driver and seal bullet. Optionally, you can use a heat gun and a fork oil level gauge. We are going to be using this ratio right to measure some things out. And then you'll also need a drain pan, safety glasses, rags. Now, as far as parts go, we have our Tusk fork seals, Pro X dust seals, some seal grease, fork oil, so we got the 5-weight from Bel-Ray, and then some suspension clean. To do this job, you got to get these forks out of the bike, but before you remove these off of the bike, you want to crack open your fork caps. And to do that, what you're going to do is leave the bottom triple clamp bolts tight. You'll loosen up the top triple clamp bolts, and then you can crack the fork caps loose using your 50mm fork cap wrench. Once you've done that, you can slide these out of your triple clamps and bring them over to the bench. You're going to want to clean them up, and that way you don't get any sand or other debris down inside these internal parts that could cause damage. So we're going to go ahead and clean these up. Now that our forks are clean, I'm going to show you how to do the right TAC fork first. So we need to release all the air from this fork, and it does need to be done in a specific order. So we're going to come down here to the balance chamber and release this pressure first. So when you release that air, you can see the length of this actually changes, and sometimes you can get a little bit of oil coming out of here too. That's totally fine, don't worry about it. Now to remove the air out of the other two chambers, we need the fork vertical. So we're going to place it in our vise with suspension soft jaws. If you need these soft jaws, they are available on our website. We're going to be using them a lot throughout the process, and they make the job a lot easier, and they're not going to damage your fork. If you don't have these, you can use regular soft jaws or a really heavy rag. Just make sure you don't damage this. At this point, we need to release the air pressure from both our outer and inner chamber in that order. And the outer chamber, it's going to have that line with the C. The inner chamber is going to have the dot and the line going to it. And it's a good idea to have a rag handy as you release this air pressure, because a little bit of oil can come out. The next step is to press this chamber cap down. That way we can access a circlip underneath here. It's going to take a little bit of force. You can use your thumbs or something soft to press down on this. So to help get this circlip out, I'm actually using this tool from Racetech that's made specifically to help remove circlips. If you don't have this, you can use a pick. And I'm actually going to rotate this circlip on ours. The opening is right by these valve openings. All right, so we'll pop that out, and you can find a new one of these under the OEM diagrams on the website, along with any other O-rings inside this fork. The next step, we're going to place a drain pan underneath the fork. Now to remove the chamber cap, we're going to place a rag over the top of it and leave just a little bit of slack up here because this next step will be messy. We're going to press up on the fork tube to pop this out, and some oil can come with it. So you can see that thing shot out, and we caught it, no damage. The next step is to remove the fork from the vise, and we need to dump all the oil from this chamber. Now before you dump the oil, I do want to point out that there's an orifice in the top of this. That orifice needs to be facing up as you dump the oil. Next, we're going to put the fork tube back into the vise. Now we can loosen the fork cap all the way. Then we'll slide the outer tube down and drain the remaining oil that's in the outer chamber. Once all the oil is drained out, we can slide this outer tube back up onto the fork cap temporarily. The next step is to remove all of the oil from the balance chamber. So to do that, we're going to clamp the axle holder into the vise. To remove the cap from the balance chamber, we're going to use a 32mm socket. Then take it out of the vise and drain it. The next step is we need to remove the center bolt on the bottom of the fork. So to do that, we're going to put the fork back into the vise. Now to get the center bolt out, that's where our fork cap tool is going to come into play. It also doubles as an Allen key for the center bolt. So we'll go ahead and take our ratchet and loosen it up. As you loosen the center bolt, it's a good idea to have a drain pen underneath to catch any excess oil that may still be in there, especially on those Hondas where you don't have this piggyback reservoir. Now that we have the center bolt loosened up, we actually need to remove it from the piston rod. So we need to expose the jam nut that's holding it on. And to do that, we're going to press down on the fork cap. We'll slide this piston rod. You know, this has what, 20, 30 millimeters right here. And now we can loosen this jam nut from the center bolt. Now with the center bolt removed, we're going to loosen this fork cap and remove the inner chamber. And as you disassemble the fork, you want to make sure you have some clean rags to lay all your parts on. Now to get these fork seals changed out, it's going to be just like any other inverted fork from this point. So what we're going to do first is remove our dust seal. And to do that, we're just using a flat blade screwdriver in between the seal and the outer tube and popping that loose. Next, we can remove the retaining ring using a pick. The next step, we need to remove our fork seal. So we're going to use both fork tubes like a slide hammer and pull these apart. Now before we slide hammer these fork tubes apart, to make the process just a little bit easier, I'm going to heat up this outer tube. You don't have to do this, but just makes the job easier and helps prevent damaging those bushings. Now we're going to use both fork tubes like a slide hammer, and that's going to pull our fork seal out. Now we're going to remove our bushings and seals, and as you take these off, pay attention to the orientation. That's going to help you get everything reassembled correctly. So for this first bushing, you're going to split that with your thumbs. The next one will slide off. We have our backup ring, our fork seal, we have our retaining ring, and last, our dust seal. Now that we have the fork disassembled, we need to clean everything up before we inspect it. So some special areas to pay attention to are anywhere where you have threads, where the fork seal actually sits, especially that snap ring groove. Sometimes you can get buildup in there. And then also at the bottom of the inner fork tube, where that center bolt goes, sometimes you can get some buildup just inside there. So make sure all those areas are sprayed out really well. Now for the inner chamber, you can spray down the outside, but you don't want to spray any chemicals down the inside. If you need to clean that out, you can use some fresh fork oil and pump it through there and flush it out that way. Now that we have our parts cleaned up, we need to inspect everything. So starting with this inner tube, you need to check the surface, check for any pits or nicks, and if you see anything, you want to run your fingernail across that. If it catches your fingernail, then it's probably going to damage your new seal. So you want to take care of that. You can use a fine file or some Scotch-Brite. It will probably damage this coating a little bit, but then again, it probably already is damaged if that happened. So if it's really bad, you may have to replace this whole piece. Now, this outer tube, sometimes they can get damaged by rocks. So if these tubes were binding up when you took everything apart, you can inspect this tube for any major damage and replace if necessary. Now moving on to the bushings, we're going to inspect this Teflon coating, and you want to make sure that it's not worn through at any point. If it is, you're going to see a copper appearance. Now on this bushing, it's going to be on the outside. This bushing, the Teflon coating, is on the inside. The last inspections we'll make are on these O-rings. We need to check the O-rings to make sure they're not flat or cut in any way. If they're damaged, you can find new O-rings on our website. So now we're ready to reinstall our fork seals and bushings. To do that, I'm going to use the seal bullet. If you don't have this bullet, you want to use some electrical tape to cover up these sharp edges as you install the seals. If you don't, there's a chance that these lips or that these edges can cut the lips on your new seal. So definitely use one method or the other. And I'm going to apply some grease to this just to help the seals go on a little bit easier. Now for the fork seals, we've got the dust seal. I'm going to apply some seal grease to it on these lips. All right, so now we'll slide our dust seal down into place. Normally your retaining ring will go on next, but we're going to do this after we drive our fork seal into place. Next, we're going to install the oil seal. Now the orientation of this, the open side is going to be facing up towards the top of the bike, closed side facing down towards the bottom of the bike, and then you'll notice there is a double lip. So the double lip is on the open side. Again, that's going to be facing towards the top of the bike. So we'll go ahead and apply some grease to this seal, and we'll carefully slide it into place. Next, we'll remove our seal bullet. We'll install our backup ring and two bushings. And make sure you apply some fork oil to the surfaces of these bushings. And the top one should snap into place. Next, we'll install the outer tube onto the inner tube and remove both tubes from the vise. To drive the seal into place, I'm going to set the fork vertically, and I'm going to use the fork seal driver on the backup ring to install the bushing first for the outer tube, and then we'll slide our fork seal into place, use our seal driver on that again, and you'll know that the seal is driven all the way in once the pitch changes, and you'll also see the snap ring groove fully exposed. Now that the seal is driven into place, we can install our retaining ring, and we're just going to spread that over the fork tube. You can press this down into place using your fork seal driver, and you want to make sure that it's all the way fully seated in its groove. Now we'll flip the fork tube over and we'll press the outer tube down onto the dust seal. With our inner chamber already in the vise, what we need to do is make sure the piston rod is fully extended, and we'll pour 100 milliliters of fork oil into it. Next, we'll apply a little bit of seal grease to the O-rings for the chamber cap. We can press that down into place and install our new retaining clip. And you'll want to make sure the retaining clip is fully seated. The next step is to use our air pump to pump up the inner chamber to 145 PSI on this bike. That's what's standard on it. You want to refer to your model specific service manual for your spec. And as we do this, this cap will rise to the top. And then the other thing, you don't want to use compressed air on this. It's going to come up too fast. You could damage something. And sometimes compressed air has a little bit of moisture in it, and you don't want that in there either. Now that we have the inner chamber pumped up to the correct spec, we need to measure the overall length and compare that to the spec in the book. If you're having any issues with your inner chamber and your measurement doesn't meet specs in your book, the service manual will recommend that you replace this complete unit. Now we can install the inner chamber into the outer chamber. We'll temporarily thread this cap into place, and we're using a little bit of seal grease on the O-ring. Next, we need to make sure the jam nut is fully seated onto our piston rod, and then we can take some grease and apply it to our O-rings. We'll take our center bolt, and we need to install this until it actually seats on the piston rod. Once the center bolt is fully seated, you should have about a 1 millimeter gap between the center bolt and the jam nut. The next thing we're going to do is tighten the jam nut down against the center bolt, and we'll torque it to 21 foot-pounds. Apply some medium strength thread lock to the threads and grease to the O-rings. Then press the center bolt in, thread it into place, and then torque it to 51 foot-pounds. The next step is to loosen up the fork cap, and we're going to lower the outer tube. And this bike calls for 300 milliliters of fork oil in this outer chamber. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and tighten down the cap. We're going to do the final torquing on the fork cap once it's back in the bike. So at this point, we're going to fill the outer chamber with 7.3 PSI. That's what our bike calls for standard. The range for us is 0 PSI all the way up to 18 PSI. And now we'll reinstall these Schrader valve caps. Next, we need to fill up our balance chamber with 10 milliliters of oil, or 10 cc's. And to do that, we've installed the axle holder into the vise, and we're using this oil level gauge syringe to inject 10 cc's of fork oil. Next, we'll install the balance chamber cap. We're going to torque this to 33 foot-pounds, and we also applied some grease to that O-ring. And now we'll fill the balance chamber up to 131 PSI. Again, you want to refer to the model specs for your bike. Next, we'll install the cap. All right, now that we're done assembling this fork, I just want to make a couple of quick points on tuning. So on these, you can think of that inner chamber as the main spring, and the outer chamber, it's going to affect progressively more and more towards the bottom half of the travel. So it's going to do your anti-bottoming. So if you need more of that, you can increase the pressure. And then the balance chamber, it kind of counteracts that inner chamber or your mainspring. And what this does, it makes it so the first half of your stroke is less harsh. So if you need to tune things, you can kind of play around with that. Now, moving on to the other fork, it's going to be like any other twin chamber fork, except you're not going to have that metal coil spring in there. So we'll go ahead and bring that fork over. All right, now with the other fork on our bench, we have our rebound adjuster on bottom and our compression adjuster on the top. We need to back these out all the way before we start disassembling the fork. But to make sure we can get these adjusters back to the same position once we're done, what we're going to do is turn each one all the way in clockwise until it lightly seats. Count those clicks, and then you'll back this all the way out counterclockwise until you feel some slight resistance. So that lightly seated, that was 10 clicks. So I'm going to write that down, and now we'll back it all the way out. And now we'll do the same thing with our compression adjuster on top. Now that we have our clickers counted and backed off all the way, we're going to remove or loosen up the fork cap all the way and slide the outer tube down and dump out the fork oil. Once you have most of that fluid drained out, what you're going to do is tip the fork up and temporarily rethread this outer tube back onto the cap. Then we can clamp the axle holder into the vise. The next step is to loosen the center bolt, and for our fork, this is going to take a 21mm socket. And again, it's a good idea to have a drain pan underneath this once it breaks loose. So once it breaks loose all the way, what we're going to be able to do is slide this whole damper down. We want this 20-30mm out, and again, we're going to do the same thing with the jam nut and center bolt, so we need to break these free. So once the center bolt is free from this piston rod, there's a push rod in here. We're going to start pulling this out, and we're going to remove the center bolt and this push rod. Next, we're going to loosen the fork cap back up and slide the outer tube down. Then we can remove the inner chamber, and again, we'll lay it down on some clean rags. Now that we have the inner chamber out, we're going to go ahead and replace these fork seals. It's going to be the same process as the other fork. We're going to take it all apart, clean it up, and install some new seals. If you need help with these steps, refer back to the first fork that we did. We're just going to do a quick cut of changing these out. Now that we have our fork seals done, we're going to show you how to service this inner chamber, and first we're going to put it in the vise. The next thing we need to do is drain the oil from this inner chamber. So how you do that is hold this fork cap still on the chamber, and then we're going to remove this base valve assembly using our TAC fork cap tool. To remove the base valve assembly and drain this oil, what we're going to do is push up on our piston, and that's going to help release this assembly. Once the base valve assembly has popped up, you want to remove it and drain any remaining oil out of it into your drain pan and place it on a clean rag. Now we'll remove the inner chamber from the vise and drain the cartridge into our oil pan, and we're going to pump the piston rod as we do that. Now if the oil coming out of this is super dirty, you can flush this out by pouring some new fluid in there, pump it up a couple times, and then dump the oil back out. The next step is to clean all the parts up for this chamber. We're going to spray everything off with suspension clean except for inside the chamber. We don't want any solvent down in there. And if you need any O-rings, or if these bushings don't look good, or any other damage has happened to your parts, check our OEM diagrams for those parts. With our chamber back in the vise, what we're going to do is pour 310 milliliters of oil into it, and we'll start the bleeding process. To bleed the chamber, what we need to do is plug both holes on the upper portion of the chamber with our fingers, and then we're going to pump the piston rod up and down until we have a smooth, consistent action and you don't hear any more air bubbles coming out. Once you've bled that up, even though we measured the oil, the service manual wants to double check that level, so we're going to do that with a fork oil level gauge. We've got it set to 135 millimeters. We'll pull on the syringe until there's no more fluid coming out. And again, you want to check your service manual for this spec. The next step is to install the base valve assembly. Now to do this, what we're going to do is push our piston rod up. We're going to cover the two holes on this chamber and keep pushing up on the piston rod until it's 20 millimeters from fully compressed. We'll set our base valve assembly into place, and then we're going to pull down on the piston rod, and it's going to help pull that base valve assembly down. You're going to have to push it in the rest of the way, and we'll screw it into place. Once it's tightened down, you're going to torque it to 22 foot-pounds. The next step is to do the final bleeding on our chamber. So we've removed it from the vise. We've made sure that our jam nut is backed up all the way as far as it can go on this piston rod. And what we need to do now is pump this chamber up and down about 100 millimeters or 4 inches several times. Once you've done that, you can compress the fork or the chamber all the way down, and that's going to help bleed out any excess oil that's in there, and we'll drain that out. Now, as I stroke the chamber all the way down, what I'm going to do is cover these holes, the 2 holes on the side, and that way we don't blow oil all over the shop. And then when we release this, you want to make sure the piston rod extends all the way on its own. If you can pull it out further, then there's air in the chamber and you need to redo the bleeding process. So at this point, we need to let the rest of the extra oil out, and we're going to do that through the 2 holes in the side of the chamber. And if you have compressed air, you can blow it in one side, or if you don't have that, you can remove this bleeder screw and let it drain upside down for a few minutes to get the remaining oil out. Now, if you think you're having problems with this inner chamber, one way to check it is to compress it a couple 100 millimeters, and you want to check around this bottom sill and make sure there's no leaks coming down here. The service manual recommends holding it like this for about 10 minutes, but I mean, usually it's pretty apparent the seal's either going to be good or bad. So if you have leaks and that seal is bad, the service manual recommends replacing this complete chamber. Now that we have the oil changed out on our inner chamber, we can reinstall it into the fork tubes. And we'll slide this outer tube up towards the cap and temporarily install it. The next thing to do is install the piston rod. Now, this has a D shape to it on the ends, so you need to make sure that it's lined up correctly. So I'm going to install it onto the center bolt first, but not all the way down, just partially, and that's going to give me enough length to where I can actually adjust this and get it correctly located inside this piston rod. So I'll slide this up into place. It's going to stop right there, but it's not engaged. I'm going to rotate it using the center bolt until it drops into place. If I try to rock it back and forth now, it won't. You can feel it's fully engaged. And now we can screw the center bolt onto the piston rod. Now with this center bolt, you'll screw it on until it seats all the way onto the piston rod. There should be a 1 to 2 millimeter gap in between the jam nut and the center bolt, just like on the other fork. So we do have the correct gap, so we can now loosen up the jam nut from the piston rod, and we'll tighten it down against the center bolt. Now we can torque it to 16 foot-pounds. Now we're going to take some blue Loctite and apply it to these threads of the center bolt, and we're going to install the bolt, tighten it down, and torque it to 51 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to remove the fork from the vise, and we'll loosen the fork cap again. I'm going to slide the outer tube down, and for our bike, we're going to pour 340 milliliters of oil down in here. So with that oil height, you do have some tunability. Again, a lower oil height, you're going to have less bottoming resistance, and higher oil height, you'll have more bottoming resistance, but you want to check the range limit in your service manual. Now I'll slide the outer tube up back to the cap. We'll tighten this down. And again, we're going to do the final torquing once the fork is on the bike. The last few steps with these forks are we need to reset our clickers. So to do that, we're going to turn the clickers all the way clockwise until they lightly seat, and then back them out the number of turns that we wrote down earlier. Once you've done that, you can install the forks into the bike. You'll tighten down the pinch bolts for the lower triple clamp and tighten your fork cap down. For this bike, it's 56 foot-pounds, and once you've done that, you can torque the upper triple clamp pinch bolts, reinstall the wheel, and that's all there is to rebuilding and replacing the oil on your TAC SFF forks. If you need any of the parts that we use today, they're available on our website. We offer free shipping on orders over $75. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.